Okay, welcome back. And once again, I'm doing some of the order of these lectures out of order. And the main reason being that test or the quiz number 3 is tonight or starts tonight. And although I have only done one lecture out of Unit 8, instead of doing the normally what I would, I'm in the middle of a Zoom in order, what was I saying? Instead of doing the normal order where I would have done the art historical lecture, I'm doing the photography lecture because that the information about photography is what's going to be on the test mostly. And so, yeah, wanted to make sure that you're prepared for that. So, and frankly, the information that is most testable is really pretty much on this first page. Like let's go on with the lecture just a little bit. We talk a little bit in this lecture about the invention of photography, about the start of photography, and a little bit of some of the different kind of technologies. But this lecture is not about comparing medium format cameras and range finders versus 35 millimeter cameras. In fact, for a lot of these, I'm not even sure which artist used which. I know Weston used medium and large format. I'm pretty sure that Bresson used almost entirely 35 millimeter. Um, Ansel Adams only used large format. Well, I guess he's using a medium format right there, but generally he used large format cameras for almost all of his work because they're monumental. Arbus entirely used 35 millimeter. And we can talk a little bit about why artists would prefer one over the other. But those kind of issues are mostly not the point of this lecture, which is more just to give you a sense of all of the art that has been made in the 20th century, really, starting in just a little bit before the beginning of the 20th century. Once photography became kind of legitimately agreed upon by a number of people to be its own independent art form, that what kind of artwork people have made with a camera. And but the beginning of the lecture is where we actually talk about the stuff that actually shows up on tests. In that this is where we have the definitions for what a camera obscura is, the definitions for exposure, aperture, and shutter speed, and probably most notably the definition of depth of field. And it would be great if I had some diagrams that went along with this first page to kind of explain some of these things. And that would that would be very helpful. And I should do that one of these days. Okay, so photography. Um, Photography is invented in the middle, like we have like the earliest kind of photographs in the 1820s, really mid 1820s. Um, but as a as a medium that people really were able to use to make art out of them, we really see it starting in kind of the mid 19th century. And what is photography? So photography is a way of combining two different things that artists and scientists had been noting, which is one, going back to the Renaissance and even a little bit before the Renaissance, artists were aware of the power of a camera obscura. A camera obscura is basically the word camera in Italian means room. And so obscura means dark, right? So it's a darkened room. And if you had a house where um, you had one room that was facing the outside, let's say with one single window, and it was dark and like didn't have any other windows anywhere on it. It had a blank wall directly across from that window. You could paper over the window with like black plastic or a couple of layers of black plastic to make the window completely dark. So the room was completely dark. And then you could put one tiny little pinhole in that black plastic, little tiny dot of a hole, right? And then if it was a really sunny day outside, the light would shine through that hole. And what it would do is it would project the light, would project an image of what you're seeing on the outside, it project an image of the outside world onto the far wall. upside down, interestingly enough. So you would be able to see an image, even though you just have black plastic in front of your window. And even though there's just a tiny little hole, if you turn around and look at the back wall, you'd be able to see an image of the world outside. But the image, and it would be a moving image, right? And the image um, would be upside down because when light comes through a little tiny hole, right, and then bends around it, that that bending of light acts like refraction, right? Acts like a lens. And so it basically is able to reproduce the image coming on the other side. And that's what is a pinhole camera. And that is what a camera obscura is. And so this is the technology that we've already been introduced to when we discussed Caravaggio. We're pretty sure that Caravaggio used a camera obscura, where he would project light onto his wet, dark paintings, and then with the image on the other side, he would scratch lines into the dark, wet paint to make kind of like a light line drawing of where all the figures were and where all the placement of all the shapes were. Okay. So, and we're also pretty sure that that Vermeer used camera obscura. So this was a technology that was well known by the 19th century, camera obscura. But you take this idea of a darkened room and a pinhole or use a lens to create a projection of an image on the far wall, right? And then you add to it that on the far wall, instead of putting something that's just a blank, like a screen or a wall, you put something that is photosensitive. And this is something that people have been aware of for a long time. To give you an example, you've all seen photosensitive materials, meaning like materials that are sensitive and change in value based on light shining on them, because every one of you has worked at some point in your life with construction paper. If you took a piece of construction paper and then you took a piece of, let's say, a black vinyl lettering, right? And you put that vinyl lettering on the window, like the number five, and then you put the construction paper over the top of the number five, right? And then just let it sit there for a couple of months. The light is going to be shining on the paper and it's going to bleach that paper and make it paler and paler, right? Um, So the paper is light sensitive, it's photosensitive. And everywhere that it's shining on it, right? But everywhere that it doesn't shine on it, where the number five is on it, it's blocked. So it doesn't get darker, it stays dark, or it doesn't get lighter, it stays dark. And so that's an example of photosensitive. So people at this time in the 19th century were already aware of like types of photosensitive materials. They were aware of how things like silver oxides were photosensitive. And so it was simply a matter of combining these two different technologies, combining, and at first it wasn't with making paper prints, it was with making plates, metal plates that had the photosensitive material put on the top of them, right? And then you expose them to light using a lens, expose them to light using a lens, and then that creates the image. Okay. So the the difference though, when we're talking about later photography, like when we get to number four, is that eventually cameras developed the idea of photographic film, and then that allowed them to then take that image and print it on a piece of paper. And so that allowed you to make multiples. You could take a single photograph, but then print it multiple times. And it also allowed it to be on a piece of paper rather than on a single metal plate, like with daguerreotypes and with what were the other kind? The calotypes, which were the two main types of photography before the invention of photographic film and photographic sensitive paper. So in a camera, any kind of camera, you're basically controlling exposure. And in almost all types of camera, you're controlling exposure. And remember, the word camera means room. So when you think about a camera that you hold in your hand, like a 35 millimeter camera, it is a very tiny little room, right? There's a little box inside of it, and that's the room, right? And so with any kind of camera, you're controlling exposure, And generally, you're controlling it by two means, through aperture, that is the size of the hole, and through shutter speed, that is the period, how long that hole is open. So once again, let's return back to the camera obscura for a moment and think about this. So you're in a room, you have a window, a large window, but it's completely covered with black plastic, so there's no light shining through, and there's a blank wall on the other side. And then you have a very tiny hole, right, in that black plastic, and then that hole allows light to shine through that tiny hole and project an image on the far wall. Okay? So you could make that exposure of that image different by coming in with an X-Acto knife and making the hole a little bit bigger. But the only other way you could make the exposure is by saying how much time, like let's say you wanted to make a photograph with this camera obscura that you have, you could put a piece of photosensitive paper on the other side of the wall. But then the question is, how long do you expose it to that light? So those are the two main ways that you can control how much light is going into the camera and creating the image. It is how big the hole is and how long you let that hole be open. So a 35 millimeter camera is called, generally most 35 millimeter cameras are called single lens reflexes. And what that means is that there's a little tiny mirror that you look at when you're looking at the viewfinder. All right, you're looking at the little tiny mirror, and that mirror is showing you the image that what you're seeing. And then at the time when you click the button, that mirror flips up for a second and light shines into the camera. And then the mirror clicks down again. And once again, you can see into the mirror, and then that mirror is showing you the image that the camera would normally be seeing. Okay, that's called the single lens reflex, and that is the primary type of camera for 35 millimeter type photography. Okay, so far we've explained what a camera obscura is, what exposure is. Exposure is controlling how much light, right? So if an image is overexposed, that means it had too much light. If it's underexposed, that means it didn't have enough light, right? You want to get just the right amount of exposure to get a good high contrast, clear image. So exposure is the amount of light that comes into the camera, and you control that through aperture, which once again is the size of the hole, right, that the light's shining through, and shutter speed. Let's talk about the size of the hole for a second, because you might be wondering, well, how does the camera control the size of the hole? If any of you have ever seen a James Bond movie, you might remember that almost all James Bond movies begin with like a sequence, right, where we have like this kind of like spiral kind of like thing, right, like this, like a camera. And that spiraling of plates, that is the way a camera creates creates aperture. It can, if you, as those spiraling plates separate from each other, it makes a bigger hole. As they close in on each other, they make a smaller hole. So by controlling the size of the hole, you can control exposure, and by controlling how long the image is exposed. So, and we'll get to, there are reasons why you might want to control exposure other than by changing aperture, right? So why, and there are also reasons why you might want to control exposure other than shutter speed, because there are downsides to both of them. But it's through those two means that you control how much exposure is getting to your image. With the development of photographic film, right, and then photosensitive paper, you can then, and then really small cameras where the camera is a little tiny room, you can then make multiples, and you have a lot more control over the images that you can make. So the last thing I need to explain to you is depth of field. And probably the best way to explain depth of field is to show you an image where we really can see. Hold on a second. I'm going to close the door, okay? All right, the main way that you can control depth of field, but first we have to understand depth of field. And so let's look at this photograph right here. Okay. Do you see how the images of these people in the background is way blurrier? They're kind of a blob. Or let's even go to here, right? Look at the difference between how crisp and sharp this young lady is versus this young man who's on the stilts, right? And how much of just a kind of a blurry, hard to read sort of, you just kind of guess as to what it is you're seeing, right? Like that's barely legs right there. That's just a blurry image that suggests legs. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. So that's that difference, right, between something being in focus and something being out of focus. That's called depth of field. If you can set your camera in such a way where like she could have shot this right now because what we're saying is we have a shallow depth of field here, right? Which is that means the stuff that's up close is very much in focus, and the stuff not that far away goes very quickly out of focus. And that's called a narrow or a shallow depth of field. Whereas a deep depth of field is where, let's see if I can find an example of that. There are a number, but let's find a really good up there. Okay. This is a really interesting image because when you think about it, this image looks like there's so much space from here to here, right? And at first, you almost guess that this stuff is blurry and this stuff is not blurry. But when you actually look at the photograph, this stuff is just as crisp and clear as these. The thing that makes the space is the changes in value, not the changing in the crispness of edge, right? So really, we have a very deep depth of field. Okay, so how do you get a deep depth of field? You get a deep depth of field by having a very tiny aperture, right? The smaller your aperture is, the deeper your depth of field is. Because if you remember, what the first thing I told you when I talked about camera obscuras, right? All you need is a small little hole in a window. And if the hole is small enough, the light's going to refract, right? So a small hole basically acts kind of like its own lens. And if you're working with a lens, that small hole kind of adds extra sharpness to that lens, and it increases the depth of field, the amount of space that that lens is going to have all the images be sharp. Okay? So, um, whereas, let's go back to this image. How do you get this kind of effect where you have one thing, or even better, this kind of effect where you have one thing really sharp and in focus, and then another thing not very far away, only like maybe 15, maybe 20 feet away, but it's completely out of focus. How do you do that? And this is a thing that, like, if you're a floral photographer, like the people who like to take photographs, beautiful photographs of like flowers, they love to have these very, very shallow depths of field where things go in focus and then out of focus really fast. How do you control for that? Well, you do the opposite. Instead of having a tiny aperture, you have a large aperture. But then if you have a large aperture, aren't you going to have an overexposed image? Well, the way you solve for that is you have a very, very quick shutter speed, right? You just open and close the shutter very, very quickly, but then you have a very large hole, and you can get this kind of effect where you have some stuff very sharp in front and stuff very blurry in the back. Okay, so going all the way back to the beginning, because we haven't actually even started the lecture yet. We're still on the first page. So that is the definition of depth of field. Depth of field is the ability of photographers to be able to control how much, how sharp the image is and at what range, how much range, right, you have of focus. Okay? All right. And so we are ready to now begin the lecture. And the lecture is going to begin with, like I said, the very early parts of the history of photography. I have to close my door again. Sorry about that. I'm going to lock my door this time around. Okay. So like I said in the very start, the beginning parts of photography were not about making photographic film, using photographic film, and was not about making prints on paper. It was using these photographic plates and making these types of photographs. And we had a couple of different um, systems that people had invented. And this is true of like technology in general. When I was growing up, there was the dialogue between is it VHS or Betamax for videotapes, right? Now a completely meaningless point of view. And there was in the early 2000s a debate of like which is the right file format, an MP3 or a WMA. Also completely irrelevant today. So similarly, the rivalry between daguerreotypes and calotypes are pretty much, unless you're the kind of photographer that actually likes to reinvent and reuse these sort of old materials, is kind of irrelevant, except for the fact that it was the rivalry between these different systems that really pushed people to try to um, to just try to outdo each other in terms of all the other technologies and all the other artistic uses of photography. And so without that, we might not have gotten to here. And so from this point on, this lecture is really about just looking at some of the beautiful photographs that people have taken, talking a little bit about some of these different artists, Steichen and Stieglitz and Lewis Hine, and a few of them I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So like with Lewis Hine, um, there are a couple of trends that I want to talk about. And one of the trends, and a lot of this has to do with what is the purpose of photography? Like Steichen really kind of explored the idea that photography needs to be about like creating art, right? Um, it needs to be artistic um, in a moody and romantic kind of way. It needs to be very um, and their photography should not be about documentation. Stieglitz was somewhat inspired by that, but also inspired by just simply the power of a camera to be at a site in a moment and take a photograph, like take a documentation of what was really going on. When you think about it, no one had that ability until the end of the 19th century, had the ability to just have a thing in their hand, right? Because even the early cameras, you couldn't do that. It was like practically like a big giant box that you had to set up on a tripod, and the exposure times were like minutes at a time, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. So it wasn't until the early 20th century that photographers were actually able to take photographs like this, like actually take an image and it represent what was going on in a moment. And because of that potential, some artists really saw photography as not just a not just a great new development in terms of aesthetics, but a new development in terms of journalism, in terms of advocacy, in terms of social reform, right? And Lewis Hine probably represents that more than anybody, where he used his career as a photographer to um, to to campaign for workers' rights, specifically children's rights. To like we owe, like there were a number of people who were fighting for to end the world where little children could start working in coal mines or in bottle factories at the age of 6 or 7. There were many writers, many journalists, many politicians who fought hard to change that world. But one of the people who worked really hard to do that was Lewis Hine with his photography. And so one of the main one of the main themes of photography is documentation, right? The documentary impulse, the desire to kind of capture the world in a moment, say this is what the world is like. This is what is going on. And we see that especially with wartime photography, because there is no other way to capture the images. Like there had been wartime like sketch artists like the in famously in the Civil War, Winslow Homer was a wartime sketch artist. He did drawings of the war, and then he would send those drawings back to artists in the city who would then make prints, lithographs, or wood engravings based off of his drawings. But really, it was a slow, tedious kind of process and far removed from the immediacy of what was actually happening on the ground. Whereas wartime photography is just immensely impactful and so immediate. But other artists saw the purpose of photography as being about being able to play with the technology, seeing it as a since it is a very technological, especially by the point of view of early 20th century, a very technological, very sciencey kind of way of making art, to make it very experimental and make it about that, about the scientific exploration and experimentation. And so you have someone like Man Ray who is working with multiple exposures to create these kind of surreal images, um, and various kinds of other sort of effects. And then we also had some artists who argued that the purpose of photography was primarily, let's get to Adams as well, primarily about the craft, right? That the goal of being a photographer was to learn to master the craft of photography to the same degree that painters or sculptors would master their craft. And to master your craft in photography, that meant both mastering the art of organizing, arranging, finding the image, finding that right moment, but also understanding and using the technology of your camera, but especially understanding and using the technology of the darkroom to get the absolute exact, most perfect image. And I think Weston was probably the first to really kind of embody this. It's emblematic of Weston that he mostly focused on still life materials and studio photography. And like when he worked with models, it was not about one of the things about Weston's work is also that it was very much about finding abstraction in the everyday world. So he loved looking at everyday objects, but then finding the kind of the internal abstract beauty of them. When we get to Ansel Adams, he'll have a different take on this idea of like the importance of craft. Bresson had his own kind of approach, which in some ways was kind of like a merging of some of these trends, right? He was very much related to the documentary photographers, the photographers who saw everyday documentation as being really important. But for Bresson, he was after this thing that he called the decisive moment. He was after these images that were not necessarily, documentations of newsworthy events, but just maybe little slices of life, but were also these moments where everything came together perfectly, like the design aspect. So like think about how a brilliant just kind of like collection of different design ideas all becoming one design idea in this single moment when that bicycle is right there, right? Or how this is a collection of design ideas, the way this multiplicity and kind of like scattering of, all these heads, boop, 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 and how that relates to all these windows on that wall, right? So each of these are these kind of interesting sort of moments where it's about finding just that right moment. As we move further into the middle of the 20th century, more and more photographers are actually professional photographers, studio photographers who are working for commercially, working for industry, working for advertising, working for, um, and so like we have someone like Halsman, who is both an independent private photographer, like artist on his own, but also worked for magazines, worked for commercial uses, right? Like this photograph of Salvador Dali that he set up, which is pretty amazing. Or someone like Yusuf Karsh, who made his living as a portrait photographer. Some of these portraits were official portraits, some of them were ones that he just commissions, but a lot of them were ones that were commissioned by publications. We need a great photograph of Albert Einstein kind of thing. Might have been Time Magazine for that one. So this is also true where we start to see a number of photographers who are both fine art photographers, but who also are employed in the fashion industry, most especially Richard Avedon and Irving Penn, both amazing photographers. And I don't know, I really should have put Ansel Adams before these guys, to be completely honest. But anyway, there we go. So Ansel Adams, in some ways, is kind of a return to the kind of like the ideas that we were talking about when we talked about Weston, the idea that the sole purpose of what makes a photographer a great photographer, right, is just focusing on the craft. And one of the things to understand um, about Ansel Adams and his craft is that it's very much about controlling and understanding value and value organization. For him, he had a very, very complex system called the zone system, where it was really important that as he organized and figured out a photograph, both in terms of looking at the view, maybe even taking some test images, and then actually taking the actual image, and then going to the dark room and producing the image, that his goal was to have a very clear set of steps of values, that he needed to have places, he needed to make sure that there were places where he had absolute lightest light, and then a clear very next value that needed to be almost as light as the lightest light, but just a clear step down. And then another value, right? Instead of all the values kind of being a blur, or instead of the values basically just going from here's a light to here's a dark, he really wanted all the values to be very carefully considered. Or to put it another way, if you were to make a painted reproduction of this, that you would he would want you to be forced to have to make like 10 or 12 different grays, that you couldn't really make it with just, three grays. You needed a gray that was almost pure black and a gray that was almost pure white. And then even if you only needed to use some of these grays in just a few spots, you needed in between grays going all the way down step by step. So Ansel Adams very much saw photography being about aesthetics and being about craft. And Diane Arbus, in some ways, was like the opposite. It was about aesthetics, but much more about the aesthetics of mood and the aesthetics of what you might call like vibe, right? It was more about the aesthetics of the people that she met, the people that she interviewed. Here is Arbus right there, and there's a self-portrait of her over there. And she was just interested in finding people that she thought were interesting and taking photographs of them. And then being perfect works of craft was not really the issue. Although she was a great composer, took, excellent compositions, and she was skilled with a camera. Like she wasn't, no slouch. Sally Mann, on the other hand, is kind of like is more interested in the technical, more interested in the craft. Golden, now we're getting to like contemporary photographers. Golden is very much kind of coming out of the same tradition as Diane Arbus, where it's about what you're communicating, who you're talking about, what you're trying to say about the world, about society, is way more important than is every photograph exactly perfect. And in fact, the sense of the photographs being um, ephemeral and being hard to separate from everyday photography, from like the normal, like the like that fact that her photographs are hard to separate from what is like, what would be a normal just photograph that anyone might take, is kind of part of the point, is to emphasize that kind of everydayness. And so getting to more contemporary photographers, Cindy Sherman, one of the artists that I think is really quite amazing. And we don't have a lot of time to talk about Sherman, and there's so much to her bodies of work, but I'll just explain a little bit about the beginning parts of her career, and I'll let you guys look her up to see if you want to learn more about her as an artist. So in her starting period of career, she made a bunch of photographs, all basically sharing the same title, which is Untitled Film Still, and then a number 14 here. And each one of these is an untitled film still. And the idea is, and she's in costume, she's the model in every single one of these photographs. And each one, she's playing a character, oftentimes a different character. And in each one, she's aiming for kind of creating a mood like it would be in a movie, but not just any movie, like it would be a movie from like the 50s or the 60s, even though she's shooting these in the late 70s. Down here, I love this, is a series of of Polaroids, and she would do these photographs, these Polaroid photographs, where she would when she was doing a shoot, and she would be playing one character, like here, and then in the next image she'd be playing a different character. She would take in-process images of her going from, you know, changing from the one, removing all the makeup, and then changing into the next. And then from there through the 80s and into the 90s, her work got way more inventive as she explored color and various kinds of costuming and makeup. And by the way, she is the model in every single one of these images. So now we're really talking about very contemporary photographers, all photographers who are alive and working right now. Um, and Philip Lorca di Corsia is an American photographer that I think is pretty amazing. And they have the the point of them is to sort of create the feel like they are just slices of moments, right? That they feel halfway like they were just snapshots, halfway like they're scenes in movies, right? And yet they're photographed with such kind of like craft and so much density of color, so much, like um that they feel somehow um in some other way special. So there's just this like vague sense of artificiality to these. Some of them seem almost completely non-artificial, like they could really be just snapshots, but generally they have this sense of like, is this a real moment in a from life? And definitely not. Like notice how on here he's actually using stage lighting, like the cast lighting that's coming off the sides there. Um, he probably has some lights set up right at that spot. So Reineke Dijkstra is a contemporary photographer who I think is pretty amazing. And I don't have all I don't have a lot of time to talk about her whole body of work, but I will talk about this series and this series where she had these one, she did these photographs where she would photograph toreadors in Spain, and she would photograph them kind of like both ahead of the the match, them fighting the bull, ahead of the bullfight, and then after the bullfight. And she also had this series where she selected a number of young men who had volunteered for military service, and this is in Holland, and then kind of like following their career, like just as just kind of photographing them at various stages of their life in service. Sujimoto is probably one of the greatest of craftsmen in photography and a brilliant thinker when it comes to contemporary art. And so just so much to look at. This is the image that actually starts the lecture. And I've seen one of these in person and they are just amazing. This is this ongoing series that he does where everywhere he goes in the world where you can see the sea, everywhere he goes, he will always take at least one, usually multiple photographs of the sea at various times, especially early in the morning. And he'll take photographs, and it's always with the horizon line exactly perfectly centered on a square photographic print. Andreas Gursky is probably one of the most famous contemporary photographers. He is the photographer who is credited with having selling the most expensive contemporary photograph of all time. And one of the things I think that's really amazing about Gursky is the way he loves the idea of photography being able to push our boundaries as to what is believable and what is seeable, right? Like that he makes these photographs that are so large and so filled with so much information. And he designs them in such a way that everything is equally crisp. The way he does this is actually composited, made up of multiple photographs that have then been put together. And so it has the sense of being almost hard to see because everything is clear, which means our eye can't focus on anything. It's like the exact opposite of like this or this, right? Where only one thing is crisp and clear and everything else is less clear. And that gives us such a very clear hierarchy of how we're supposed to look at the image. This image is kind of the reverse. It's like it's anti-hierarchical. Every square inch of this photograph is dying for our attention. If you're wondering what we are looking at right here, this is a neutrino collector underground, just outside of Tokyo, I think. It's somewhere in Japan, and it's like maybe about a mile underground. Like neutrinos are these subatomic particles that fly through space, and they fly, and they're so tiny, right? They generally fly. They go all the way through Earth, just zip right through it, right? And so to detect them is very hard. And the point of this detector, this is underground, is that it's actually not collecting the ones that are coming to Japan. It's collecting the ones that are coming from the other side of the Earth, and it's collecting and have gone, because it's only the ones that have already gone through most of the Earth, or gone through the core, that have been slowed down enough that this collector with these gold balls and this pool of water here in the bottom, I don't know how it works, but anyway, that's only the neutrinos that have been slowed down enough will actually be observable in this collector. Anyway, that is the end of the lecture, and so we'll end it there. This was a strange one, a lot of interruptions. All right. I will speak to you later.